Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for The Man Trap, which is episode 6, not episode 1, episode 6 of season 1 of Star Trek, the original series. This video is part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek in order, one episode at a time. In this video, I will cover The Man Trap. The Man Trap is the episode where they go on the planet to check on two settlers, a married couple, the woman being an old flame of McCoy, and they find things are acting strange, and then crewmen start dying, and it's revealed that McCoy's old flame is actually dead, and who they thought she was actually a creature that is killing people in order to eat salt, because it needs salt to survive, and this creature is the last of its kind. And so the husband had been living with this creature because she can take the form of anyone. She was taking the form of his dead wife, but eventually it comes to a point where the creature is about to kill Kirk, and McCoy has to make the decision and finally decides to kill it, even though it has the form of his former lover. So this was as I said, it was the first episode that aired. And a lot of people call this the first episode of the original series, but it's not. It's the 6th. As I said, I think production order is the proper way to do it, particularly because you can track the projection of the way the crew members sort of evolve, like you see them start to grow into their characters, so it makes no sense to watch it out of order, because then the characters revert to earlier versions written in and then go forward to what they've come to develop. But I've already talked about this at length, but I think it's worth mentioning here because I do think a lot of these characters are really well developed. I will say this about this episode. I think each of the characters that appear get their own scene. They get their own moment, which actually happens less as the show will go on. Some of these minor characters will not get as much screen time, but here we get a nice scene between Uhura and Spock, where Uhura is sort of talking to Spock about Vulcan and sort of saying how he's cold, and it's implied that this is actually meant to be a flirtation scene. And there was one other, I believe, in Charlie X, I think is the other one, where they apparently toyed with the idea of putting Spock and Uhura in a relationship, but then quickly dropped that. But apparently the reboot Abrams films picked up on that and did that. So I guess what those Abomination reboot films did, it was not completely against Star Trek canon, because they actually did toy at that a little bit. But anywho, and we also get Sulu and his love of botany. We see him with his plants. This also explores Rand a bit and her relationship with Sulu. And it also is a great character story for McCoy. It's the first one that really fleshes out his character, which I think is odd to make this the first episode of the air, because they show it first and then show him after his character had, show afterwards. They show before this episode when his character wasn't developed yet. So it's really whack, I think. But the thing about this episode is funny because a couple of the executives didn't really use the term showrunners in the 60s, but the producers involved were talking about the decision to air this episode first. So they had several episodes that were completed. The Cobra Knight maneuver apparently had not finished post-production, so that wasn't an option. But they had completed Where No Man Has Gone Before, Mud's Women, and The Naked Time. And one of the producers wanted to do The Naked Time and thought that would be the better one to show first. I think they said the networks chose Man Trap over Where No Man Has Gone Before because it was more action and it featured a monster. It was more typical of the sci-fi horror of the 60s, which is probably why I don't like it as much. And here's the thing. I disagree with that it should have been The Naked Time, because that is I think that episode works better if you're already familiar with these characters, if you already know who they are. I don't think it's a very good introduction to the characters because it shows them acting crazy and silly and losing their inhibitions. And so I think that works better if you already have a baseline for who it is. And I do apologize for that noise. My cats are playing with the toys in the background. But anywho, so... yeah, so I disagree. I don't think it should have been the Naked Time, but I don't think it should have been the Man Trap either. I think the Man Trap is a bad choice because it's a Dr. McCoy-centric episode where he's not the main character of the show, and in fact, he wasn't even around for the pilot episode. They first introduced him the Cobra Knight maneuver, which I think should have been the introduction of McCoy. Would have made more sense. I think showing the audiences McCoy before that episode. I think you are supposed to have a familiarity with McCoy. I think it helps this episode as well to have a familiarity with McCoy, even if it's just from one other episode before watching this. And also, the fact that it is a typical horror sci-fi schlock is what I have against it, and I think it doesn't necessarily represent the best of Star Trek. Now, the funny thing is most of the cast apparently agreed. Most of the cast involved apparently said that out of all the episodes, that the first couple episodes that were ready to go that they could have aired first, Man Trap was their least favorite. In fact, Shatner called it one of his least favorite of the entire series and said it was a really bad episode, which I don't know if I'd go that far. The original series certainly had worse episodes than this one, but I wouldn't even agree that it's the worst out of the first 5 that were ready to go. That is Mud's Women, which was clearly the worst. And that would have been the worst episode to air first. And apparently Roddenberry wanted to, but thankfully the studio overruled him because that was a terrible idea. And they presented having, a fat guy basically act like a pimp and pimp out, women to minors is not really what they want to show. First foot, show what Star Trek is about. It's not really what it's about. And I don't think having, a monster going around killing people on the crew is really what it's about either, but it's, more accurate representation of what Star Trek is than Mud's Women. Fuck them Mud's Women. So, then you might ask me, well, what episode would I choose to air first? And, well, that's easy, Where No Man Has Gone Before. Now, granted, if you saw my review for that episode, you'll see that I'm not a huge fan of that episode, and I thought that was kind of poor. I gave it a 4 out of 10, so I'm not a huge fan of that episode either. But we're taking the Cobra Knight maneuver off the table because it's it wasn't done post-production. If we weren't, I'd probably go with that one, to be honest. I think that might make the best first episode. But if that's off the table because it's not finished yet and they need to go with something that's finished, then Where No Man Has Gone Before. And plus, for the simple fact that they should have fucking aired the episodes in order anyway, which is why I'm going in the production order, because I think that's the only way it makes sense to watch them. Like, don't do it out of order. Especially since, as I said, like, a horror is wearing a yellow uniform for, I think the first 2 episodes, Mud's Women and Cobra Knight Maneuver, she's not even in Where No Man Has Gone Before. And Sulu's wearing like a blue uniform in Where No Man Has Gone Before and is shown as a science officer, so it makes no sense to switch back and forth between this. Just go in the correct order, for fuck's sake. But even leaving that aside, I would still go with Where No Man Has Gone Before, because as much as I don't think that episode's that good, and The Cage was a way better pilot, but that's completely off the table because they're not showing that because that didn't get picked up. It still was the best out of these 4 that showcases what Star Trek is and what it's about, and gives it the best the audience the best sort of picture of what it's going to be. And I read that there was a lot of negative reviews when Man Trap first came out that a lot of people were like, well, this show Star Trek doesn't look good. I think and one of the critics was like, why didn't they just air this as a Saturday morning cartoon? Ironic, because in the 70s they will. But yeah, they're saying that it was stupid and schlocky, and I could get that impression off of this episode. If all of you seen of Star Trek is this episode, I completely understand people thinking this show's gonna suck. Again, not that this is a terrible, terrible episode, but it's not that good, and it is typical horror schlock, and it is not representative of what really Star Trek is. And that's also another reason why I never call this the first episode. Why, if ever I go in order of my watch or review of anything of the original series, I don't do this first. In fact, as I talked about in other videos, when I was growing up, when I watched Star Trek on syndication and VHS, which were my only two means of watching it back in the 90s when I was a teenager, they showed them in production order, both of them, syndication and VHS. It wasn't until like DVDs and streaming service they started doing air dates, and in fact it wasn't until this time, until the early 2000s, I first learned that Man Trap was the first episode ever aired. I didn't even know that. As far as I knew, they went in production order because that's the order I was used to. So there's also a nostalgia thing involved with me trying to get, always using production order over air date. Air date just doesn't make any sense to me because, I don't agree with their decisions to air them out of order like this. I think it's the incorrect way to view it. Now, I talked about that topic so much in so many other videos. Let me get more into the specifics of Man Trap. Now, I never really liked this episode. I never hated it. I never picked it out as one of my least favorites or one of the worst, but I never considered this a good episode either. It was one of those throwaway episodes that just existed that I kind of just, if it was on, I guess I'd watch it, but I would never seek it out. And looking back, and as I said, watching this for reviewing and analyzing it does give me a little bit of a different perspective. And I do think they do a good job at the character story involved. I do think they do a good job of creating that dilemma that McCoy is, being distracted by meeting up with the lost love, the one that got away, how Kirk describes it as log, which I think is that gets the point across to the audience, but that's not really how a captain of a starship should refer to this in his log. But that's just me. That's just what I think. But, so I think they do a good job of having the character stakes involved, that McCoy is in love with this woman and is so delighted to see her again and see that she's basically still in love with him, but then refusing to believe that this isn't actually that woman, that she's dead and this is some creature that's going around killing the crew. And you also have, I guess this predates Invasion of the Body Snatchers, or at least maybe there was an earlier version. I know there was a 70s version, but maybe there was a remake and there was a 50s version. I don't know. Someone will correct me, I'm sure. So maybe it doesn't predate it. But it does have that same feel of it. Now, I will correct, I think, some bonus material and books and stuff that and maybe some other references referred to this species as a shapeshifter, but they're actually not. Not in the sense that, say, Odo is a shapeshifter, or that weird woman in the prison in Star Trek VI who was a shapeshifter, or even Lord Garth apparently had the ability to shapeshift. With her, it's more of she doesn't actually, or the creature doesn't actually change shape. It seems like it projects an image inside the minds of those looking at it to make them think they're looking at something, which is different than actually physically changing form like Odo does. And so I wouldn't classify it as a shapeshifter. I'm trying to think if there was another example of a species that did that. Maybe that weird alien dude from the Voyager episode, what's it called? Something of vision, persistence of vision, where it seems like it could do all these illusions, projections. Actually, it's more like the Tellusions, actually. That's probably a better example from The Cage, and maybe that's where they got the idea from. But the Tellusions could create, of course, any delusion anyway, make anyone think they're seeing anything, whereas this creature's abilities are much more focused, where it can just make the person think that they're seeing it as something different. Because I think this is exemplified in the first scene where McCoy is seeing, Nancy Crater, or Nancy, I don't know, she had a maiden name before she married Crater. Well, I mean, I know she did, but I don't know what it is. But anyway, he's seeing Nancy the way that she looked, exactly how she looked when he last saw her 13 or 15 or however many years ago it was. And he's like in awe and keeps going on, how does she still look like she's 25? But Kirk sees her the way he would expect to see her in her 40s. And it's like, well, doesn't look 25 to me. I don't know what you're talking about. But then this other dude, a random red shirt, even though he's wearing a blue shirt, he's still red shirt in my book because he dies. Anyway, he sees some chick he had a fling with at some pleasure planet, and of course, he brings that up very stupidly, and McCoy's like, "Watch your tongue, boy," which is silly that he would probably know better than actually just blurt that out, where it's very obvious McCoy has some feelings for her. But anyway, so multiple people are looking upon her at the exact same time and seeing different things. So this is, to me, what makes it clear that it's not a shapeshifter like Odo, that it's projecting these images inside their head. So it's more of telepathy rather than shapeshifting. But it seems like its telepathy is limited to, it's like a chameleon, they describe it later, is limited to affecting how others see it and nothing else. Like it couldn't make McCoy look different to Kirk, for example. It can only make itself look different to Kirk, if that makes sense. And I think that's how they established it to be. And so, yeah, it does kind of turn into your stereotypical monster story because it goes around, killing the crew members and they constantly wanting Saul, especially when it pretends to be that one dude who it killed, and then it pretends to be him and beams back to the ship pretending to be him, and then he acts super fucking creepy and follows Rand around, refusing to say anything and trying to grab the salt off her table. Yeah, that's very horror cliche, and especially the way they play it where there's an invader on board, it could be anyone, and it's very clearly McCoy. Now, to be fair, I was going to say they were all too dumb to figure this out, but to be fair, Spock kind of catches on to this, and he's not sure, but when McCoy goes off with Professor Crater to do this thing, Spock's like, well, let me come with you. And McCoy's like, yeah, sure, whatever. And as soon as they leave, of course, it attacks him, and he only survives because he's Vulcanian. I don't know if they mentioned Vulcanian in this episode, but I know I just watched season 1 of the original series less than a year ago, and I know from that they're going to use the word Vulcanian a lot during season 1. It's going to be really irritating, but it's not until late season 1 and season 2 where they've solidified as Vulcan. But anyway, I don't know if they do say Vulcanian in this episode, but I'm going to have to get used to it because I know it's coming. But anywho, Spock said something really, really weird, it's because my ancestors spawned from a different sea. I'm like, why don't you just say it's because you're a Vulcan, or you have a different genetic or biological makeup? Why do you have to be all poetic and because my ancestors spawned, they risen out of a different sea? It's the kind of dialogue that's actually commonplace in the original series, and it sounds very schlocky to me. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. Point is, yes, this is a stereotypical schlock horror, which is why I don't like it that much, and why I never gravitated toward it, and why I wouldn't say it's a good episode. But it injects some personal character beats and characters. And as I said, there were interesting character beats, like a horror talking to Spock on the bridge about, haven't you ever bathed in the moonlight and on Vulcan? And he was like, well, Vulcan has no moon. And she's like, why am I not surprised? Like, that was interesting interaction. And as I said, Rand and Sulu talking about their plants. They had this plant that was very clearly someone had their hand in the glove pocket going again. Low-hanging fruit to make fun of the bad special effects of the original series, but I'm still going to. But anyway, so so there was interesting character beats and the main character story of McCoy, like, having to come to terms with the fact that she's dead. And it's an interesting character examination of Professor Crater. Now, I've heard some people criticize and this storyline saying that they don't really buy, because what they're saying is that this creature killed his wife, but then he kept it around and lived with it because it pretended to be his wife, and apparently it needed love in the same way it needed salt. That was a bit cheesy, especially that line. It needs love just as much as it needs salt. And it is hard to buy that he would love the creature that killed his wife. But I could understand, especially since they're like alone on this planet and no one's around an entire planet, how he could have a bit of Stockholm syndrome and maybe like grown some affection for the creature. But I don't think they necessarily portrayed him as in love with the creature, but more of sympathizing with it, as they make the analogy of the buffalo, saying that this is a race that went extinct, and this is the last surviving, instead of wanting to preserve the race for it. In fact, the way that Kirk and crew sort of hunted down, rather than trying to save it and preserve it and find some other way to give it salt that doesn't involve killing people, which surely they can do, and like take it to some Federation sanctuary or whatever that saves species. Why didn't they do that? And it's because this episode is schlock. That's why. So I have to give it points against that. It wants us to sympathize with this being the last of its kind, yet the crew make no effort to save it. Anyway, so my rating for The Man Trap out of 10, you know what? I'm going to give this episode a 5. Average. Because it's average. Like, I think before I might have given it a 4. But as I said, like, looking at it, analyzing it, I see the character interactions are actually well done, and as I said, they do the side characters really well, and have this sort of interaction, camaraderie in the crew that you don't find in every episode. And they do a good job explaining, McCoy's connection to his lovers, just through the lens of a typical schlock. So 5. Average. It's fine. So anyway, that is it for my review of The Man Trap. Now, as always is tradition, I shall give a huge thank you, shout out to all of those who support me on Patreon. That's very much appreciated. It really helps the channel growing. And it's very much appreciated. So we want to give a shout out to Anthony Denabictus, Ricky, Maddie Jester, Joel Aviles, Brian A., Alessandro Michelaccio, Norman Buckwald, Stephen Kennedy, Brenton Berg, Allison Fordyce, and Brendan Howells. Thank you so much for your support, and if you would like to support me on Patreon, it would be very much appreciated. The link is in the description below. You get the extra benefits like pre-releases of videos like this, and my exclusive Revisited series where I revisit episodes I had already reviewed and add some more opinions, or maybe alter my opinions depending on the episode, which is exclusively on Patreon. And if you're finding me for the first time, be sure to check out my channel, as I do many more Star Trek videos, as well as covering other shows like Prodigy and many more shows. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.